as you heard from previous presentations, there's a lot of work going on right now with phase one, whether it's integration with NetDMR into CDX or the biosolids report, or getting ECHO ready for showing DMR non-receipts for non-majors. So there's a lot of work going on, but we're in addition to that, we're also already thinking about phase two. So one of the things that we wanted to highlight is the initial recipient process that was outlined in the rule. And the initial recipient is the government entity that first receives the data that's being submitted. So if a facility is filing a DMR, this initial recipient designation makes it easy for the facility to figure out, what do I send it to the state or do I send it to EPA? It's important to note for this initial recipient designation that authorized states will continue to retain their responsibilities to facilitate electronic reporting. For example, they'll continue with outreach and training to support electronic reporting. They'll continue on with their permitting and compliance monitoring and enforcement activities. Just to restate this, regardless of the initial recipient status, EPA does not take over any permitting, compliance monitoring, or enforcement activities from the authorized program. We will continue to assist authorized programs with their training and outreach needs, as well as provide other support, grants, technical support, so that the states can fully understand and use EPA's electronic reporting systems like NetDMR, NET, and ISIS, and thereby provide support to facilities that are filing these electronic reports. So the rule requires EPA to maintain a list for each state and for each data group, and you can think of the data group as a report. So the data group number for DMRs is number 3, and you can see the full listing in Table 1 of Appendix A of the rule. And what we're intending to do to make this easy is to create a lookup tool on its website to facilitate easy identification of the initial recipient. As of the effective date of the rule, the initial recipient determination is an opt-out process, which is that by April 19th of this past year, or of this past April 19th, states were required to give us notice if they wish EPA to be the initial recipient for a particular data group. Here's a quick snapshot of the lookup tool that we intend to make available on our website. You can see that someone could punch in their NPDES ID, and then they'll be able to see the results, their facility name, and then all of the reports that that facility has to file. And in this particular case, they'll see which phase, implementation phase they're in, whether in phase 1 or phase 2, and also who the regulatory authority is. In this particular case, Virginia does not have the federal biosolids program, so EPA would be the regulatory authority for the sewage sludge report, and Virginia, in this case, Arlington County would be submitting their biosolids report using EPA's NET tool. We would have a link there to CDX, which would allow them to initiate the electronic reporting process for this report. If that same facility wanted to file a DMR, we would have a link here to Virginia's EDMR system. Virginia has an EDMR system. And then as we build out other reports, for example, the pretreatment program report. This POTW has a pretreatment program, so when that report is ready, we'll have a link there. And then if they have a sewer overflow and they have to report, we'll have a link there. So this is meant to make it super easy for people to understand where they need to report and how to report. So back to the initial recipient designation process. As I noted, states had to tell us if they wanted EPA to be the initial recipient. They had to do so by April 19th. 6 states sent us such notices, and we published the results in the September 9th Federal Register notice. For all other NPDES programs, the state is the initial recipient. So who are the 6? These are the 6 what we call opt-out states. And you can see Georgia, Nebraska, Oregon, and Rhode Island all requested EPA to be the initial recipient for all of the data flows. New Jersey requested EPA to be the initial recipient only for the CAFO annual program report, and North Carolina requested EPA to be the initial recipient for low erosivity waivers and no exposure certifications. So we will be using this data, this information, in that lookup tool that I showed you earlier. Okay, any questions? I'm looking at Eddie. Any questions on the initial recipient process before I go into the next topic? Having none. All right, good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the new data elements that will be integrated into our data system called ICIS NPDES. They're new for our data system, but they're not new for EPA's regs. What we did in developing the rule is we worked closely with states over a 5-year process via a technical work group, and we used this technical work group to define the data that must be electronically collected, managed, and shared with EPA. And that was a very successful work group where we went through all of the different programs, pretreatment, biosolids, sewer overflows, and we identified for each of these programs the regulation that requires reporting, the information that was required to be reported, how to take that language. Sometimes maybe look complex, sometimes it would a little fuzzy, and we tried to break it down into specific data elements that everyone could agree on. And in the end, with the final rule, there was agreement on that set of data elements in Appendix A. And so what we'd like to do is continue this collaborative process by, again, re-engaging with states to better define the reference values, business rules, and other data standards for the minimums for these the minimum set of NPDES program data, which we loosely call Appendix A. So, for example, earlier this year, EPA led a technical work group to develop the draft biosolids annual report form. This is the form that will be filed electronically starting next February. We met biweekly. We had representatives from a number of states and regions, and we worked through all of the tasks, including defining the reference values. So what are the options for each data element? What are the design and text and form processing business rules? If it's a number, is it a floating point decimal? Must it be positive? Very kind of technical stuff. But when you're talking about data and processing and making sure that everything works, this is absolutely critical. So our plan is to lead similar technical work groups for the other NPDES program sectors. Our plan is to complete requirements for all of the Appendix A data elements by December 2017 or soon, very soon thereafter. And we will start work with regions and states to develop a plan for transitioning general permits to electronic reporting. So we will use the information from the Phase 2 implementation plans, which we'll talk about very shortly, and we'll be using that to help us transition the general permits where notices of intent or no exposure certifications are filed. Those are the implementation plan, and these work groups will help us flesh out all the details for these data elements. So this is our proposal, and we're seeking comments. If you disagree or have any suggestions, our idea is that we would finish out the core NPDES permitting, compliance, and enforcement data starting next month, finishing that up in December. There's really only about maybe a dozen or so of these data elements. We'll be collecting the requirements. Hopefully, for some of these turning around and implementing them in ISIS by April, and then turn to the other programs, starting with the pretreatment program. So starting in March and then going to August, we would be working on the pretreatment program annual reports and the semi-annual report, which is submitted by SIUs where EPA or the state is the control authority. And then we would also be focusing in on the pretreatment information that's submitted on the NPDES permit application or notice of intent. So that's what we're thinking of doing in March through August of next year. And then also simultaneously, another work group will be working on the CAFO data elements, the concentrated animal feeding operations. And hopefully there's not too much of an overlap. Again, we're looking at bi-weekly meetings where we could go through all the data elements, develop the forms, look at the options, figure out what's best for people to and what they want the data and how they want the data to be collected, which would influence reporting. And then once we finish those two work groups, then we would turn to a very minor report, but it's listed in the rule as it relates to cooling water intake structures, 316B. There's some permit application data. That will be September through December. And then because of a separate rulemaking, we would be delaying development of the MS4 program data elements until 2018. Now that may vary depending on the timing of the NPDES MS4 general permit remand rule, but that's why we've scheduled that last. So that's a little up in the air, but we wanted to make sure that the work that they're doing on that rule is reflected in the work that we'll be doing in this technical work group. So let me just also say that before we kick off any of these work groups, we will be sending out notices to states, to state associations, to the regions, asking for subject matter experts. We've had good success with the pretreatment program. We're doing that now with the sewer overflow group, and I expect we'll have good participation with pretreatment, and we hope to have good participation rates with CAFOs and the other sectors. So that's the data elements and the work that will support the program program reports. What's also needed is an effort to transition the processing of forms under general permits from paper to electronic, and we're also looking for a work group, a more extended work group. This would not be time limited. We could see this work group going on for a number of years, but basically it would look at all of the general permits that need to go from paper to electronic, and to be able to prioritize and identify the schedule for when we would convert a general permit from paper to electronic. So by our count, where we've looked at those general permits that are issued by EPA or are issued by net states. These are the 4 states that I mentioned earlier that will be using net. Now this, we will update this table, these figures, as we learn more from the Phase 2 implementation plan. So if you're a state and you would like to use EPA's net system for processing general permit forms, we can certainly include your general permits in these figures. In order to prioritize and schedule general permits for conversion from paper to electronic reporting, we would look at the permit expiration date, the number of master general permits in a sector, the number of master general permit covered facilities, and the implementation schedule for the new Appendix A data elements. So what that might mean is if we have a one permit that covers a dozen or 20 facilities, maybe that's a lower priority than a facility that's permit that's covering 500 or 1,000 facilities. But in also looking at that permit that has coverage of 1,000 or 500 facilities, we would also want to make sure we account for the training and outreach needs. So these are all things that need to be worked out through dialogue and discussion, and we hope to kick off this work group starting next April. So what I'm going to do now is ask my colleague to come back, and he's going to give us his just a quick update on the sewer overflow work group.
Hello again. So, as it says here, the EPA, we're currently leading a technical work group to develop the draft sewer overflow event form, as well as better define the POTW specific data elements in Appendix A. So we've been meeting bi-weekly for the past just over 2 months now, with 66 technical work group members from a variety of states and regions that have been providing us with interesting demos of what's going on in their states and feedback about how the form could be improved to better suit the needs of the many different people that will be using it. So I think, yeah, we've definitely made a lot of good progress with that. I think we're close to having some forms to send out. Yeah, so as it says here, we reviewed sewer overflow reporting approaches from California, Maryland, Michigan, Connecticut as well. And we've discussed how to implement POTW-specific data elements. Yeah, okay, sorry, as I already said. Yeah, so if you have any questions about the work group or are interested in participating, have any contributions, please get in touch with me. As you can see, my email there is yourish.jesse@epa.gov.
Great, thank you, Jesse. I'll ask my other colleague, Eleanor. Oh, no, sure, Michelle, thank you, to come up and give us a quick update on EPA's Federal Construction General Permit, which is a Phase 2 permit, but because it's being reissued next February, it's been prioritized.
Thanks, Gary. So yeah, I just wanted to briefly go over our schedule for the Federal Construction General Permit. The first milestone we've actually completed as of October 28th, and that was finalizing the wireframes for a streamlined CGP registration. And we're going to be integrating with CDX registration, so that way hopefully our users will have one user ID and password, and they'll be able to use that to access all our different e-reporting tools. And the registration will look and function very similar to the streamlined NetDMR registration, and if any of you were on last week's webinar, we did a demo of that, so it will look very similar and function very similar. Our next milestone is November 18th, and we plan to have the wireframes for the entire CGP workflow completed. And this will include the 3 different forms, the Notice of Intent, the Low Erosivity Waiver, and the Notice of Termination. And we will also have the actual flow of the form, kind of the various notifications or error messages and emails that get generated as you work through the form. All those pieces will be worked out as well and put into the wireframe. Then on January 6th, we'll have a full working prototype of the entire CGP workflow, and that'll be something that we can demo. In mid-January then is when we plan to do user acceptance testing. If anyone is interested in doing testing, they can let me know, and I can make sure to include you on the notice that gets sent out and on any testing materials you might need. On January 31st then, we are going to publish our detailed user guide, and that'll have information on what's expected for the different data fields and even examples on how to complete them. Then on February 17th, we will also have some video tutorials available, and those will probably be some short videos, maybe a couple minutes, that'll focus on how to complete specific steps in filling out and submitting the CGP form. And also on that same date, February 17th, the CGP form will be in production and available for use.